I am somebody like many of you that just really enjoys learning more about cover crops and seeing the many different ways they're being used by farmers. I got exposed to cover crops at a very early age. We used them on our farm in central Illinois when I was growing up in the 1960s, and my dad would talk to me about some of the benefits of cover crops. And that farm that I help my mom manage today, my dad's passed on, is 100% cover crop. So I get to experience it kind of from the farm management side. But I started working with them myself in the early 90s, doing research at University of Missouri, and have grown cover crops probably 25 seasons in the field myself over the years. So we're going to actually today take a look at two different modules or training PowerPoints we have available to you. The first one is a relatively short one, talking about the business of cover crops in terms of trends and opportunities. And then we'll get into economics. And these two topics certainly go hand in hand, very much so. So the overall topics we'll hit are to first take a quick look at some cover crop acreage. Some of you may be fairly familiar with this, but I think it's always useful to kind of see where we're at with what's happening with acreage. Look at some of the new approaches with equipment. That's something that's always fascinating to me. What's going on with ag retailers and some other ag companies in terms of business opportunities? And this applies to a wide range of small startup companies and mid-sized companies working with cover crops. And then some of the farm level economics, which is, of course, a very important topic when we look at the expansion of cover crops going forward. So in terms of adoption across the United States, and I'm sorry I don't have the Ontario figure there, but we do see some differences from state to state. Definitely the highest acreage by state is in the bigger ag states, as you'd expect. When I first looked at the 2017 Census of Ag data, I was a little surprised to see Texas being relatively high. Of course, they have a lot of land to begin with. They have a lot of winter wheat that ends up getting used as a cover crop, and sometimes because they don't have enough moisture to harvest it as a grain. But so looking just at acreage is one thing we can do, but I actually find it more interesting to kind of look at this data in another way, which is the map on the right. The one I just showed you is on the left, just the straight raw acres per state. Again, the darker colors like the purple being the highest states for acres. But what is the percent of the available cropland that could be planted to a cover crop? And we're talking mainly a winter cover crop here that was planted to a cover crop. And when you look at it that way, you see the higher adoption levels are in the Eastern Corn Belt. Now, I think there's a few reasons for that. I've lived myself for 5 years out in the Maryland, D.C. area working in agriculture programs there, including USDA. And of course, as many of you know, there's been longstanding interest in cover crops in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, particularly Maryland, Delaware, Virginia, Pennsylvania. And they've had programs, both incentive programs and very strong education programs going back to the mid-1990s on cover crops. So I think it's no surprise that over 25 years now of many different education programs as well as incentives driving adoption out there. And so we see in some of those states adoptions in some cases well above a third of the acreage being planted to cover crops. Maryland, depending on how you count it, typically runs 40-45% of the acres in cover crops. And we see individual counties in the Eastern Corn Belt there are above 50% adoption of cover crops. And I think that's really important because it shows us what's possible, right? Sometimes you'll hear people, especially in the Midwest, say, well, yeah, cover crops, I know there's benefits, but they're just not used around here. I don't think we'll ever see a lot of them. And I just think of those states further east where, they have found these are states with corn and soybeans. You drive around Maryland, it's mostly corn and soybeans, and they're finding ways to get this done. Now, it's true Maryland has had a high incentive program rate, but there are other states with less, like Pennsylvania. There's a county in Pennsylvania, Lancaster County, that's probably around 60% cover adoption. And that's, again, been driven by education, lots of farmer field days. Steve Groff's farm is in that county. He's done a lot of amazing education work and other programs. And even in the Midwest, we do see counties that have higher than 25-30% adoption. course, the trend has been upwards. The two censuses of ag, and those are done only once every 5 years, that have asked the cover crop question are the 2012 and 17. Unfortunately, we don't have earlier data because they didn't ask about cover crops. So we'll get another count this fall with the 2022 census. But you can see that quite a few of our Midwestern states had big jumps in acreage, in some cases more than doubling. Now, I know Iowa and Indiana would probably say they're more in the ballpark today of closer to maybe 1.5 million acres based on some satellite image analysis and other information. So we know that trend is going upwards. I believe in Missouri, where I'm at, that we're over 1 million acres now in cover crops. So this trend is continuing upwards in many of these states. Just kind of looking backwards, going from 2012 to 17, it was a 50% increase. And I think we could see another 50% increase by the time we have this next census report out. I was interested to see how many farms were using cover crops. Over 150,000 farms in 2017 were using cover crops. Now, the other thing you can note, though, is that was only a 15% increase from 5 years earlier. So that tells you that a lot of the growth in acreage was on farms where they were already using cover crops. And we've seen that same thing in our national surveys on cover crops have been managed through my office. We've had 8 states that more than doubled their cover crop acreage in that 5-year stretch. And I think we'll again see some doubling here when we get the next census. 10 states had over 20% adoption. So I think if you're talking with somebody that's skeptical that we'll ever see much adoption in a particular area, just point out that there are many other places that have achieved high levels of adoption, and there's a variety of factors that come into that. So we've looked back a little bit. Let's look ahead. If we continued, just as one way of evaluating this, the average growth of 8.4%, we would be getting to about 40 million acres towards the end of this decade. Now, of course, no trend line continues forever, but I will tell you through the SARE CTIC survey that I've managed that we've seen pretty consistent upward trends. It certainly varies from year to year, depending on when the timing of fall harvest is. You know, the crops get out of the field early enough to get cover crops planted. But, we're still definitely on a strong trend upwards. And if we do hit that 23 million acre figure, again, that would be a 50% increase. We have a lot of factors driving that, and I'll talk more about those in a moment. So part of what comes into play with any new agriculture innovation is equipment. You think of advances back in the 1800s, whether it was the cotton gin or more recently with no-till planting, equipment always factors into it. And I think, of course, with cover crops, one of the things we've seen the most innovation in is the seeding methods. So many of you are quite familiar with these high clearance spray rigs that have been adapted in some cases to broadcast cover crops and to standing crops. In this case, this is a Hagie unit. These are manufactured in Iowa. I've had a chance to tour their factory and talk to some of their staff. And they've tried a few things, but one is to take their high clearance sprayer. They take out the spray box and put in a seed box, and then they have a blower, an air blower that blows the seed out through these tubes over a 90-foot boom. And then there's a little metal diverter that when the seed comes down those plastic tubes causes the seed to be broadcast into the corn. So you might say, well, what's the advantage of this over an airplane? Well, there's some similarities, of course, in terms of the timing. What Hagie or other companies doing this would say is that they can do it on a windy day. If it's really windy, you're not going to be spreading seed with an airplane. They can certainly be more precise. Occasionally, you'll hear folks say, well, my neighbor got some of my cover crop seed and wasn't too happy for whatever reason. On the downside, if the field is wet, that's an advantage to the airplane, right? You may not be going through the field if it's particularly wet, but in late summer, usually we can get through the field. I think the real thing that's important with these high clearance rigs is that a lot of our ag retailers, of course, have these, and they have a labor capacity that is not heavily used at the time we want to be doing the seed. They've pretty much finished up their summer spray programs, including fungicides. They haven't yet started their fall fertilization. And so I think we're going to see more and more of our ag retailers using this type of equipment to help provide that service of getting cover crops seeded. Now, will we see more innovation? This was a prototype unit Hagee showed me. This was from a few years ago, where they had a couple different ways of trying to get the seed incorporated into the soil. And they found some success in doing this, but they also found the types of units were slower than the one I just showed you. They couldn't get over as many acres. So this has not yet been as widely adapted, although there's a few of these types of units out there. What we have seen an explosion in is the vertical tillage tools modified with broadcast seeders. I was at a big farm show many of you are familiar with called the Farm Progress Show that alternates between Illinois and Iowa. The Illinois one happens just a few miles from our family farm. And when I was there, this was, let's see, 2020, they had, I think, 7 different equipment companies showing cover crop seeders integrated with their vertical tillage tools. So most of them that had a vertical tillage tool there were showing that option. And you can see on the right side a little display about using the cover crop. So we have many, many farmers using these vertical tillage tools. It's a way to get the cover crops seeded in an operation that's already happening. And I think, again, we're going to see more of this going forward. And it's not just limited to vertical tillage tools. This was from the same farm show, some other types of tillage devices that have been modified with cover crop seed units. So seeding of the cover crop is one thing, but then there's the seeding of the cash crop. We really haven't seen the bigger manufacturers making a lot of adjustments yet for cover crops. Part of that reflects the fact that many of our planters are pretty well set up to plant into cover crop residue. This is just a trial we had at the University of Missouri when we were experimenting with a lot of different closing wheels into high residue cereal rye. And not surprisingly, if you've looked at this at all, there are differences that happen. The more traditional round rubber wheels or round steel wheels, in some cases, are not as effective when we're going into a no-till high residue situation. These spiked wheels often work a little better depending on the soil type and conditions. So I think we'll see some continued innovations there. So innovations in equipment is one type of business opportunity, but there are definitely others. We're seeing more and more companies that provide ag services such as fertilizer and chemicals also start selling cover crop seed. By some surveys, as many as half of our ag retailers now sell cover crop seed, and many of them are providing at least some level of management advice on cover crops, including adjustments to fertilizer management. Now, this is important for any of us that work kind of in the farm advising sector, whether you're public sector or private sector, because we want to make sure that we're providing consistent information to farmers. If they hear different things from different people about how to use cover crops, they're more likely to just say, I'm just not going to do this because it's too confusing. So we all need to be speaking with the same voice here, providing similar information. I think the Midwest Cover Crop Council provides a major role in helping get out the information like this webinar today. And I'd point out we're not quite there where we need to be. For example, I've mentioned my family farm in Central Illinois. We've got some of our land is spread out, and one of our tenants told me 2 years ago that his fertilizer dealer who was spreading the cover crop seed told him, well, let's use some buckwheat. Well, buckwheat's a fine cover crop. The problem is they were seeding the cover crop in November. Any of you that are familiar with buckwheat know it's one we'd use in the summer, not in November. Now, they were putting the buckwheat on with oats, so at least they got the oat part okay. But, I just shook my head and I told the farmer, I said, you really don't want to use buckwheat. Well, then the next year he got the same advice from that fertilizer dealer. So again, I think we have some work to do from the education standpoint. As I just talked about, seeding methods from the ag retailers is something I believe we're going to see more of because we find that's a barrier to many farmers adopting cover crops, as they don't feel they have the time to get them seeded, so they just don't even try. If they can have their fertilizer dealer help with that or another dealer, that'll be important. And of course, we see them doing termination services routinely. And then helping, I think the more full service companies are looking at how they can help farmers monitor their changes in soil health. So just to kind of wrap up this segment, one thing I look at is what is the size of the cover crop industry in the US? Well, we can talk about acres. We probably had roughly 21 million acres last fall that were planted. Again, as I said earlier, that would take us on a trend line to get to closer to 40 million acres towards the end of the decade. So what does that look like in terms of just the seed industry? Well, that's really $1 billion seed industry. And when you start talking billion numbers in industry, you start to get the attention of some major players. So think about, for the example, right now, most of our cover crop seed is being sold by smaller companies, a couple of mid-sized forage companies, but none of the big commodity seed companies are yet engaged with cover crop seed sales. And I've talked to some of those industry leaders, and what they say is, they're waiting until the industry gets bigger. But at some point, we're going to see some of the bigger seed companies get engaged. And I think as we approach this $1 billion mark, it will definitely happen. The flip side of that is we've got to have the seed production. So I've done the calculations, others have looked at this, to sell 40 million acres of cover crops using the mix of seeds that are currently being used in the United States would require over 1 million acres of seed production. Now, rye is being produced all over the place by various farmers and others, but some of our cover crops are concentrated in the Pacific Northwest, particularly the Willamette Valley of Oregon. If you've ever been to that valley, beautiful place, very diverse. They have something like 200 species of economic crops, but they have a lot of demand on their land. They have vineyards, they have hazelnuts, they have vegetables, they have all kinds of things. They grow a lot of grass seed for the turf industry. So the seed companies based there are, willing to grow more cover crop seed, but land is in short supply. So I think this is a challenge we have, finding more places to grow cover crop seed that are appropriate to each species. As I mentioned earlier, we have over 150,000 farms that were using cover crops in 2017. So we have thousands more each year. So that creates a training challenge for all of us to help working with those new growers that are getting into cover crops. And I think you're all familiar with some of the forces driving this growth. It's certainly like anything, when we can measure what we're doing, that's a factor. So the new soil health measurement, the consumer demand for sustainably produced foods, company interest in carbon sequestration. As you know, we have literally a dozen or more different soil carbon payment programs available now. Farmer desire for profit. We're going to talk about that in a moment. And this motivation to leave the farm in better shape for the next generation is something you hear a lot of farmers talking about with cover crops. So several different motivations that I think are going to keep pushing us forward. And we'll see with some of the new USDA programs, continued movement as well, such as the Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities, the $1 billion program that Secretary Vilsack announced a few weeks ago. So I expect to see quite a bit of additional investment in cover crops through that. All right, I want to change gears here and talk about what's happening with the economics with cover crops. We have great interest in this question, how does the economics really look? So to help answer that question, we took a lot of our farm survey data that we had through SARE, CTIC, and we took 5 years of that data and kind of crunched the numbers further to look at what was really going on with economics. So we felt that looking at that farmer data was more important than maybe looking at some smaller university replicated trials, although we looked at that data as well. And we came out with a detailed bulletin that was written for farmers and farm advisors, and that's available for free on the website. You can read it online or get free print copies. So just do a search for SARE cover crop economics and you'll find that. So what I'm going to do with the rest of my time is take you through what we learned through our evaluation efforts. We had a team of people working on this about cover crop economics. And of course, this is something we're continuing to learn about, right? There's no perfect set of information, and it's highly variable from farm to farm, but I think we can provide some summary information that's helpful to new growers of cover crops. So one thing we can do is look at specific case studies. And in our effort with the report I'm going to talk about, we just looked at a few case studies. It was not the major focus for our efforts, but if you wanted to look at other case studies, the Soil Health Institute did a wonderful series of detailed case studies with 100 farms, many of them using cover crops, most of them using no-till, and that data is available online, and others have done it as well. So the Rulons are familiar to people that are in Indiana. It's several family members that farm together collectively. And they've really been unique in very carefully documenting their economics, their yields, their production practices. And so they've got a great data set to work with. What they've documented is that after using cover crops with no-till, that in their case, in central Indiana, that the soil organic matter has risen by about 1% in some fields over a decade. Working with Purdue University, they evaluated that nitrogen leaching was reduced by 50%. And more importantly, for the economic side of things, that they were cutting some of their input costs. So they were cutting nitrogen by 35 pounds an acre, phosphorus by 20 pounds, and potassium by 30 pounds an acre. Now, in our survey data, we find that roughly half the farmers don't change their fertilizers, at least in the first few years of cover crop growth, but many do. And the Rulons are an example of that, especially as you get soil changes over a multi-year period. They also have documented that they're getting somewhat higher yields than their county average, about 7 bushels for corn and about 2 bushels for beans. So we're going to look more at some larger numbers of farmer data on yields here in a moment. Grazing is often cited as a subject of interest for cover crop economics. We'll talk more about that later too, but just as an example, Justin Sahadra is listed in the bulletin as a younger farmer that has really seen some benefits economically to the grazing. Interestingly, when you talk to Justin, and I've been able to do that a few times, he really focuses on the labor savings from an economic standpoint. But certainly he's gone into some details looking at the profitability as well. And then Junior Upton is a Southern Illinois farmer. He's been doing cover crops for a long time, likes to do a mix. In his case, he's got some fragipan soils that create some challenges for him. And he has seen some real benefits for yields and also being able to use less fertilizer, get better weed control. So these farmer case studies are helpful, but again, what we wanted to do is look at the large numbers from our farmer surveys, where we're typically getting over 1,000 farmers providing information on their practices. So one thing that we looked at is the seed cost. This is a pretty easy thing to get at with the farmers. For our report that I referred to, we used data from the early years of the survey when we had systematically asked about that. At that time, the median cost per acre was $25 for seed. I actually think it's less than that now. We had a more recent survey that showed farmers are finding ways to get more economical with seed cost. Planting the seed really varies depending on whether you're using something like a vertical tillage tool or an airplane. Airplanes, helicopters can be at the higher end of that range. And also termination cost can really vary because some people routinely are putting on a burn down herbicide application, whether they have cover crops or not. So it's no extra cost to terminate. Others are using a winter kill cover crop. So we felt from our survey data, in the majority of cases, farmers were not incurring an extra termination cost, although certainly some do. So we felt that the median cost for using the cover crops, just in terms of buying the seed and getting it seeded, was $37, but there's obviously a wide range. I have talked to farmers individually that are doing it for less than $20 an acre and others that are spending more than $40. So just depends, of course, on the individual situations. Now, I mentioned farmers are finding more economical ways to do this. Part of it is by the species they're using. More often, it's by their seeding rate. Maybe they started out with 60 or 70 pounds of cereal rye per acre, and now they're using half of that. The method is really important. I mentioned the Rulons. This is a picture of one of their planters. They actually do a variety of things. They do airplane seeding, they do some drill seeding, but their preferred tool, as I understand it nowadays, is to use their row planter because they can get over a lot of acres with that, and they can use somewhat lower seeding rates than they would with a drill, and certainly less than they would use with an airplane. And then, of course, where you're getting that seed source, are you growing your own seed, or are you buying it and having it shipped a long way? All those things factor in. But again, for this particular analysis, assume $37 per acre. I would say that's probably on the high side or conservative number. For many farmers are doing it for less than that. So the cost of the cover crop seeding, that's the easy part of the economic analysis. The more challenging part is the returns, because there are so many things that come into this. Are the yields impacted? Do we have any lower cost? And then how does the yields change from year to year, this resiliency? So let's look at each of these in turn. We did have good yield data from our national SARE CTIC survey. Typically, most years that you're seeing here, we had data from about 500 farmers. And what we asked is those farmers that provided yield data to only give us yield data if they had cover crops on a field with similar management, similar planting dates, and similar soils to a field with no cover crops. So we might have had 1,800 farmers filling out the survey, depending on the year, but only 500 that had those comparable yield situations. And then when we crunched the numbers, we also excluded any farmers. If a farmer gave us their yield data just for cover crops and did not have a situation with no cover crops, we took that data out. So the big yield difference was in 2012, the drought year. And I'll talk a bit more about that a little later, but basically we saw close to a 10% yield difference that year. In other years, it was much more modest. The corn yields were in that kind of 2 to 3% range, soybeans more like 3 to 5%. And again, this is based on several hundred farms. Now, if you've got any experience with cereal rye before corn, you know that you can easily end up with yield losses on corn following cereal rye, especially if you're not adjusting management or terminating that rye early. So again, these are averages. There are definitely farms where yield has been lost. There are also fields where yield increases were higher. Another thing we saw that's kind of intuitive, but it was important to document, that is the more years you use cover crops in a field, the more of a response you see. So in that very first year, and we actually had 2 years where we kind of were able to get at the number of years a cover crop had been used in the field. That was 2015 and 16, again, about 500 farmers each year. In the very first year of cover crop use, on average, there was almost no difference with corn. There was a slight statistical benefit to the cover crops, but again, you had fields where yield was lost and others where it was gained. But by 5 years, there was a small but very noticeable 3% yield gain. Again, all these figures in this table are statistically significant. The soybeans were more of a response, 2% after 1 year and increasing to 5% by 5 years. Now, these were 2 relatively normal weather years across the Corn Belt as a whole, not overly wet or overly dry. Certainly individual counties may have been, but as a whole, relatively normal weather years. So again, in more extreme years, I think we'd see more of a response, but in normal conditions, a modest but noticeable response. So what does that do to these returns? Well, if you take that $37 an acre cost, the yield impact based on price information for our row crops in 2019, and of course, prices are quite a bit higher for corn and soybeans than they were in 2019. And then very slight savings on it with a couple of factors. We see that in the first year, obviously it costs money to use the cover crops. This is common knowledge. We know that the very first year you go out and plant them, it's going to cost you money. But the key thing is we found by 3 years, on average, we were breaking even with corn and soybean production. And then in subsequent years, you're making money. You know, it's returning a net profit. So that's significant to know that what that kind of return looks like. And again, in 2019, when prices were lower, these are our basic assumptions: $9 for soybeans, 60 bushels an acre. That's based on national averages, corn, 350, and so on. Again, there's lots of details about the assumptions in the report. I would encourage you to read that to see all the details. I'm going to move ahead just to keep on time here. And I want to emphasize, you know, I think the challenge we have in talking to farmers about cover crops, they hear that statement, well, it's going to cost you money that first year you use them. And it just becomes a convenient reason to not use them, understandably, because, you know, they need to make money, pay their loans that year and so on. But at the same time, when we look at other agronomic management, there's no question that we invest in things on farms that don't pay off in 1 year. Liming is a really good example. In most situations, it's going to take 2 or even 3 years for a lime application to pay off from a yield standpoint with cost. So farmers readily do that. It's a very routine practice on any of our more acidic soils. Of course, all farmers are buying equipment, whether new or used, and they know that's going to be a multi-year return. So it's common on farms to make these multi-year investments, but for some reason, it's been a little harder to help farmers think about that. So I think that's just a challenge for us working with cover crops, is to keep talking about that multi-year investment, stressing the word investment angle with it. Well, these are average numbers. We felt when we were doing this analysis, it was really important to look at different management scenarios because every farm is different. I often hear that from farmers. Well, cover crops are great for the Rulons in Indiana, but I'm over here in Missouri, I've got different circumstances. So we wanted to look at, depending on the farm's priorities and situations, how does that change economics? So we came up with 7 different common management scenarios that a farmer might be facing, and then looked at how that would factor into the economics. One of the emerging trends we're unfortunately seeing is the rise of herbicide-resistant weeds. These are moving further north. They're showing up on more fields. We started to see them on our Illinois farm the last 3 years where we'd never had them before, and they're really becoming a problem. I mean, if you talk to southern farmers, they have lost whole fields for particularly cotton production because they just were not able to control these weeds in any sort of cost-efficient fashion. What we found in looking at that situation is that there was an extra savings on herbicides, and we had to use certain assumptions that are going to vary from farm to farm, but we assumed an extra herbicide savings of $27 per acre. And that's notable because then the cover crop pays off in year 2 for corn and actually in 1 year for soybeans. So somebody that's really facing a tough challenge with herbicide-resistant weeds, it could potentially pay off to use cover crops like cereal rye ahead of soybeans right away in year 1. Now, again, not in every case. I want to stress that. So we were assuming, first of all, about 60% of our farmers were reporting herbicide-resistant weeds even several years ago. That number has only gone up. We did not look at the impact on yield loss or grain dockage, which there would be in a lot of cases. So that would be even more in favor of cover crops. But we know that typically what happens is a farmer that's been using maybe 1 post-emerge herbicide application will have to go to 2 post-emerge herbicide applications to deal with these herbicide-resistant weeds, and that they're often moving to more expensive residual herbicides instead of some of the ones they've used in the past. So we based that on the fact that this would just be a typical scenario, certainly not every farm, but that you could have a $12 an acre savings. Again, this is 2019 figures from 1 fewer post-emerge spray. So we're still assuming the farmer is making a post-emerge spray, but instead of going to 2 sprays post-emerge, they're doing 1. And the cost of material and application, $12. Likewise, we're assuming that they're staying with a less expensive residual herbicide and that would be 15. Now, this is based on what we're seeing from survey data, talking to individual farmers and also talking to some ag retailers about what their experiences are working with farmers. Again, some farmers were saving more money, some were not changing their program at all. So just be aware that it highly varies. Compacted soils. It happened that 2019, when we were working on this analysis, was a very wet spring, and we were seeing lots of compaction. So that was kind of timely to be looking at. We know that the normal approach to that is to go out and with a large tractor and a deep subsoiling unit of some type and try to rip that soil, loosen it back up. And that can certainly provide some short-term benefits, but we also know that maybe not a real good long-term solution. So based on some research at Ohio State University, it cost about $15 an acre, according to the University of Minnesota, to do a subsoiling operation when you consider equipment, fuel, and labor. If you're not doing that $15 an acre subsoiling, the cover crops can pay off in year 2 for soybeans and break even in year 2 for corn. I would just refer you to our full report that goes into that a little bit more in detail. But basically, the Ohio State research showed that the cover crops were really equally good to subsoiling, in some cases a better long-term solution because they're creating more permanent root channels and improving that soil structure. Now, this year, 2022, of course, one of the biggest things on farmers' minds is fertilizer cost, and quite understandably is just shot up like crazy, the cost of nitrogen in particular and overall fertilizer cost. And so if a farmer is really focused on trying to address their fertilizer cost, maybe has a low fertility field, here again, the cover crops can be somewhat more helpful depending on the species used, of course. So the cover crops could break even in year 2 for corn, not really a difference for soybeans though, because of not having the nitrogen factor. So here we just said there was no difference for soybeans. I'm going to just move past this to keep us on time, but again, you can get into those details in the report. Now, this is an interesting one. When converting to no-till, you've probably all heard stories about when farmers switch from some more conventional tillage or reduced tillage to no-till, that they often face a temporary yield dip. That first year or two of using no-till, it seems like their yields go down, and then eventually they start to recover. Interestingly, I'd been hearing a lot of anecdotal reports from farmers that if they started a field on cover crops, let's say this was a no-till farmer that rented some new ground that had been conventional. So let's say they put cereal rye out there, and then the next spring they started no-tilling some soybeans into that, and then kind of eased into their no-till that way, that they weren't seeing those yield dips. Now, I'll be the first to say we need more research on this, but I've heard enough cases of this from a lot of different farmers. I believe there's something there. So if we assume that you're not going to have that yield dip with the cover crop, then that looks really good because you're saving about $24 an acre from the no-till operation, saving you trips over the field. And that cover crop will then pay off in year 2 for corn and potentially break even in 1 year for soybeans. So this is certainly a situation a lot of no-till farmers are looking at, or even conventional farmers that are thinking about converting to no-till. Again, I'm just going to keep moving so we can finish up and have some time for questions. So grazing cover crops is one of the things that's cited most often as a way to make cover crops profitable quickly, and we definitely found that to be the case. Here, the quick summation is about a $50 an acre benefit from the grazing, with the cover crops paying off in year 1. Now, there's a lot of assumptions here. I'm going to spend a moment talking about this because the assumptions are really important here. They can vary so tremendously based on the grazing system. So we had an economist, Alan Weber, that developed a hay replacement model for this. And Alan is not only an economist, but he's actually someone who farms himself and grazes cover crops himself. So he's quite a bit of firsthand experience with this. You could look at a rate of gain on the cattle, but he chose to look at the hay replacement model. And he used some pretty conservative numbers. He can assume that the cereal rye would generate about 1,500 pounds dry matter per acre. It can easily produce more than that, but just conservatively looking at that number. He also assumed conservatively that about half of that biomass would be lost from hoof action and the cattle just simply not eating all the plants. So he was assuming that you're effectively harvesting about 750 pounds of dry matter of rye per acre. He looked at that as replacing the equivalent of a little over 1,000 pounds of hay, because he's assuming 78% of the hay would normally be utilized and fed out in the field, and that the hay would have 88% dry weight. At that time, he was valuing hay at $80 per ton, and a small additional savings for not having to do the haying with reduced machinery, fuel, and labor costs. So the thing we don't know what an individual farmer will experience is, do they have any fencing at all? What's it going to cost them to buy some portable electric fencing? Do they have portable water tanks? So we kind of just assume that they have some of that already. If they have to go out and put in a lot of fencing, including perimeter exterior, permanent fencing, obviously those costs could go up, but there's the potential for it to pay off in year 1, just may take longer depending on the upfront investment cost. Now, incentives. We all know there's lots of cover crop incentives. Really the biggest program out there nationally is the NRCS EQIP, or Environmental Quality Incentives Program. Each year, these rates are adjusted a little bit at the state level. One state may keep theirs the same, and other may tweak them. They all have a basic rate that is just assumes there's at least one species of cover crop being used, and it's applicable to any farm. Most of our states, I've looked through literally all the states in the country, the majority of them are at $50 or more per acre, but we do see some that are less, like Iowa's on the low end of the spectrum at $34 an acre. Again, these are fiscal year 2019. Most states offer a higher rate if you're doing multiple species. In some cases, it's 2 species. Other states will say 3 or more species. And then many have a higher rate if you're a beginning farmer or a limited resource farmer or fall into other categories. Just kind of keeping in mind what these rates look like. When we look at the cost, as long as that incentive payment is at least $32 an acre, that's making the cover crops pay off in year 1. Now, keep in mind some incentives like at the state level or soil carbon payments are less than $30 an acre, but it certainly helps cut the margin. It makes it more affordable to get into cover cropping. But when you have a farmer that's resistant to maybe thinking about it, worried about the economics, these incentives can really help ease that transition into cover cropping for sure. I just wanted to finish up with this resiliency angle, and then we'll up and have some time for questions. Because resiliency is something we all know that cover crops factor into, but it's kind of tough to evaluate from an economic standpoint. I showed you that 2012 data where the yields were close to 10% better on corn and even a little higher on soybeans. And in 2019, we had that very wet spring. We've seen some data, and there's further analysis going on, that also the cover crops seem to really help in 2019 in a wet year. So really dry year, really wet year, those are more extremes, but we're seeing those somewhat more often, the climatologists tell us. So how do we evaluate that? Well, of course, a big part of it is that management of soil moisture. Most of you have seen a rainfall simulator like pictured here. You see the cover crop in the middle where there's very little runoff, it's infiltrating readily, whereas that tilled soil to the left of the cover crop, the water is running right off and going into that front jar. And if we flip those over, I'm sure you've seen something like this, that tilled soil is in the front, the water is not infiltrating at all, whereas it's readily infiltrating to the cover crop tray of soil that was flipped in the back. First time I saw that several years ago, it just sort of blew me away because I'd done some no-till work, but I'd primarily used tillage in my research plots over the years. And it was pretty eye-opening to see that for sure. And really, of course, what's happening when we look at a field like this is in that tilled soil, of course, yes, it's convenient for seedbed preparation and it makes for a very uniform planting situation. But we're losing all the advantage of those macropores created by earthworm channels and root channels. We're also not building our aggregate structure. We may have more of a problem with some type of plow layer or disc layer. And so all those things factor into how quickly the rain can infiltrate, how much moisture we can store in the soil, how well the cash crop roots will grow deeply into the soil. Lots of factors come into this. We know that with the cover crop, we can have a residue layer there that can reduce soil evaporation, that mycorrhizal fungi that can be better with many of our cover crops, and that those fungi allow the soil or the crop to access more water and nutrients into the soil, which is especially important in a dry year. And then even the rooting. In Missouri, we have a lot of soybeans after soybeans, and if we can grow a crop like a cover crop like cereal rye, that tends to root deeper than soybeans. And so those soybeans the following year will follow those root channels of the rye more deeply into soil and give them more access to water and nutrients. So when we look at kind of this resiliency angle in a dry year, we would say that there's an extra return based on what we saw in 2012, at least, of $58 on corn and $65 on soybeans. Keep in mind that was with lower prices existing in 2019. So that made the cover crops pay off right away in 1 year. I mentioned 2019 being a wet year. This is a photo of a farm in the spring of 2019. The field on the left is a cover crop, no-till, long-term field with those practices. The one on the right is conventionally managed, no cover crops. And same soil type, you can see the water has infiltrated on the left. You can guess which field would be planted earlier, right? This is something we've seen on a large scale that in many cases, not every situation, but many cases, the fields were planted earlier. And we know more farmers are using tools like planting green, that they're leaving that cover crop grow longer. This is kind of the extreme example of soybeans being planted into 5-foot tall cereal rye, but it provides a management tool if we're having a wetter spring to help manage that soil moisture. Now we have to be careful, of course, we don't want to over dry the soil. So it's important to really pay attention to what's happening with the forecast and so on. So just to sum up all of this, 3 key points. First of all, in evaluating cover crop profitability, we need to do this from a holistic perspective. It's really about gaining efficiency as part of soil health improvements with the overall system. And secondly, I think in communicating about cover crop economics, we very much need to talk about a multi-year timeline. This is a multi-year investment. Just like applying lime or buying equipment, it's going to take time to see that beneficial return. But on average, like I showed earlier, about a 3-year return. In many situations, it could be faster, on a particular farm situation. This last point I just made about resiliency, that we know that cover crops can really help there. And if you kind of equate it to our federal crop insurance system, any farmer that's buying crop insurance knows that it's not going to be something that pays off every year, right? It may pay off 1 year in 5 or 1 year in 7, but it can be worth it. They may do it because their bank asked them to, but it's part of their risk management strategy. And I think that's another thing that we should be communicating about cover crops, is this is part of our overall risk management strategy and making our cropping systems more resilient. So bottom line, we definitely want to value cover crops not only for their immediate benefits, but also an investment in long-term success of the farm. And again, I'd refer you to this full report for details. I had to kind of quickly go through some things, but if you wanted to see the individual assumptions, those are all in that report. Just do a search for SARE cover crop economics and you'll find that report. So thank you for participating this morning, and we have a little time for some questions and discussion. I will stop sharing. Thanks.
All right. Well, it looks like you've answered all our questions, Rob. We don't have any in the chat right now. I just put the link for our survey, and that also includes the CEU QR code. That's in the chat for anybody that needs CEUs or wants to provide some feedback. Any questions?
Hi, Rob. This is Helen Van Beck with American Farmland Trust, and thanks so much for your presentation. I also work with the Illinois Sustainable Ag Partnership, and we are working on creating a service directory in Illinois to help connect farmers with service providers, who can provide consultation on cover crops and types of tillage and that kind of thing. And one of the things that you mentioned, about the farmer getting, multiple years in a row getting kind of bad advice made me think about, how are we going to provide quality control, right? So maybe it's not that great to connect farmers with folks who aren't really providing the best advice. So I'm just curious if you kind of have thoughts on kind of the best way to do that, or the approach to take to make sure that we are kind of spreading that education.
Well, I think the key thing is for any of us that are working with cover crops to try to connect with those ag retailers to get them to participate in training opportunities, whether it's webinars or workshops or field days, so that they get a little more experience, because it's understandable their primary business may be fertilizers and herbicides, and they're just not really focused on cover crops, and they hear a little something or whatever, and they just may not even know where to look. They may not be aware of the Midwest Cover Crop Council, for example. So I think if we can just help pull those people in to some of the conversations the rest of us are having, and get them to realize there are some good resources for them, then that will help. So I see that as almost more important than our direct outreach to farmers, is working with those farm advisors that are connecting to a lot of farmers. So yeah.
Great, thanks.
I know I'm really fascinated by the amount of cover crop acres and the seed needs as we increase cover crop adoption across the Midwest and the nation. Any additional thoughts on that?
Well, I think there's going to be some nice opportunities for individual farmers to get more involved in producing seed. We've certainly seen a lot of Midwest farmers starting to grow some of their own cereal rye. That's a fairly easy one to get started with, as long as you have some access to seed cleaning. Now, farmers doing that do need to be aware of seed laws. It's one thing to grow it for yourself. If you're going to sell it across the state line, then you've got a whole set of seed laws that come into place that need to be aware of. And even if you're just selling it to your neighbor in your same county or state, You know, it's important to get that seed tested and develop a seed tag for it so there's complete information. But there's definitely opportunities. I think we have some training opportunities too to help develop some new areas of seed production so that groups of farmers can kind of band together to develop collective seed cleaning and seed marketing. I think there'll be a definite opportunity there. Of course, not every cover crop can be grown well for seed. Just anywhere in the US, you've got to pick the right agroclimatic regions for certain species, but there's definitely going to be some more opportunities there because that can be a profitable alternative to just growing a commodity crop to be in the seed production business.
Yeah, and in Indiana, I've talked to our seed commissioner, and it's very important to get that seed tested. They've seen a lot of variability with kind of homegrown cereal rye with germination rates.
Definitely, and unintentionally, you know, somebody may end up with some weeds in their seed that, if it's not cleaned effectively, can be a real problem. And so, yeah, it may seem simple to just grow some seed and keep it, but we got to be very careful with how we handle that, especially if it's being sold to other farmers.
I've got another question about kind of cover crop adoption trends that you talked about in your presentation, and you know, being in Illinois and thinking about the NRCS strategy. And I'm just kind of curious how, you know, the trends that the adoption, the expansion trends and the timeline that was in your presentation, how does that compare to some of the goals that are that are laid out in the strategy?
I'm sorry, what strategy goals are you referring to?
In the Illinois NRCS.
Well, I haven't seen that particular Illinois set of goals, but you know, I think it's clear that there's a lot of room for additional adoption. And one thing we've done that I did not talk about is look at what drives adoption at the local level, like where there are counties that are uniquely high in adoption versus their neighboring counties. In many cases, that is due to a really effective spokesperson on cover crops. It may be a farmer, it may be an extension agent, it may be a nonprofit leader, but they've been effective getting farmers to attend field days, participate in coffee discussions, whatever it is, to kind of allow farmers to not only learn about cover crops, but I think just as importantly, to get their questions asked, because it's a pretty major change to adopt cover crops. And I think a thing that holds back a lot of farmers, besides, yeah, they don't have time to seed it and they're worried about cost and all that, is just if they can talk to somebody about their questions, and preferably to another farmer, that is going to really increase their comfort levels. So in the past, we might have said, well, we want farmers to, you know, make a minor change in their nitrogen fertilizer application. Let's just do a press release or give a talk, and there'll be a magazine article and the farmers will adopt it. But I don't think that's enough with cover crops. I think farmers understandably have a lot of questions how it's going to work for them. So they need to be able to ask those questions to other people. So the more farmer networking we can set up, or getting farmers connected with each other, really helps. So I'm sorry, I don't know the specifics of the Illinois situation, but I think when we look at the continued adoption, those are some things we need to be thinking about.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Well, we really appreciate your time today, Rob. A lot of things to think about. Well, we just had one come in. So getting cover crop companies involved with Midwest Cover Crops Council. Yeah, we actually have an industry position on our board, and we actively seek input from those cover crop companies. I think there's always room for more input though, right? So we definitely invite those seed industry folks into our discussions. And I think as we kind of ramp up cover crops, that's going to be all the more important. So thanks for that comment. Okay, well, if there's nothing else, again, thank you, Rob, and thanks everyone for attending. And we'll be back here next week with a couple more cover crop topics. So thanks again.
Thank you.